If you brought a Bible, we're going to be in the book of Ecclesiastes today, and I encourage you to turn there. We'll be in chapter 1 some. We'll be in chapter 2 some more. If you don't have a Bible, some of the scriptures will be on the screen, but I want to share with you a message that I've titled pretty simply, The Search for a Meaningful Life. The Search for a Meaningful Life. And I can promise you that whoever you are, that is something that is fitting for you in your life. We all want to make sure we live a good life. We want to make sure that however long our life is, when we get to the end, that we can look back and say, well, I did something with it. I found some meaning or some purpose there. Really, the message of the book of Ecclesiastes is a message all about that search. Ecclesiastes is this book of wisdom in the Old Testament. It's very ancient. It's a little different from a lot of the other books in the Bible. So many books of the Bible are more or less about how to be a believer. They assume a certain level of faith in the revelation of Scripture. Ecclesiastes takes a little bit broader of a perspective, and it's not just as much about being a believer as it is about how to be a human, right? How to be a created human being in this thing that we call the planet Earth. And so that's the message of Ecclesiastes. And if you were here last week, we introduced it with a message I titled, Welcome to Earth. And we saw some brutal honesty from this great ancient book of wisdom. Today we continue that series called with a message called The Search for a Meaningful Life. Now, in my opinion, pretty much every book that's ever been written is really trying to find an answer to the search for a meaningful life, whatever the book's about. Pretty much every poem, every love letter, every song, every piece of artwork, every movie, all the celebrated pieces of cinema of the last 100 years, all your best picture nominees in the Academy Awards, they're always sort of getting at this one thing. What's life about? How do I make my life count? And Ecclesiastes hits that note just right. And so I want to share with you here, we're in the second half of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're also going to look some at Ecclesiastes chapter number 2. I'm continuing this series called The Good Life, a series through Ecclesiastes. We'll look at these 12 or so chapters of Ecclesiastes for about 2 months, give or take. And as we do that, this morning, I want to share with you the search for a meaningful life. We're going to look at three things: the search itself, so what it's like, what it's about; the options, right? Those things that we can try in our search for meaning to find meaning. And then we're going to finally conclude with the answers that Ecclesiastes begins to offer here in chapter 1 and chapter number 2. So let's begin with the search, all right? The search for a meaningful life. Ecclesiastes 1, verse number 12, down through verse 18, they describe this search. It says there, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. There's a way to describe life. This miserable task given to keep us occupied. I have, he says in verse 14, seen all the things that are done under the sun, and I have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. He even concludes his search this way. He says, what is crooked cannot be straightened. In other words, what is broken in this life, right? No matter whether you live 10 or 100 years, you're not going to be able to fix it. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, see, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, even madness and folly. And I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. It's a very poetic, image-laden way of saying you reach out and try to grab it and you can't. You can't catch the wind in the same way. You're not going to be able to catch exactly what it is to live and to be alive and to be able to just know that and figure that out. It's too much. He concludes almost with a note of despair in verse 18. He says, for with much wisdom is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. As you guys all well know, long gone are the days when we were children and the biggest things we had to worry about was whether the ice cream truck was going to come by our neighborhood that day. Long gone are those days. Now, I want to cheer you up a little because what we just read is not very cheery, all right? I believe that the great message of Ecclesiastes is not one of darkness, but that this darkness is just a tactic. Okay, it's the author of Ecclesiastes' technique to really drive us to the end of ourselves to realize, hey, if this life as it is now is all that there is, man, that's not all great. Because there's a lot of difficulty, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of heartbreak, there's a lot of unfairness here in this life. But I want to give you some hope just to keep you hanging on, all right? The book of Ecclesiastes can be a dark and even depressing affair, but every so often, and we're going to hit one of these this morning, there are these little shafts of light that break through the darkness of the mood of Ecclesiastes. And what we want to do as we work our way through Ecclesiastes, we want to grab onto these shafts of light and find all the hope and the meaning that we can there, because that's the point. And if we only come away from Ecclesiastes feeling a sense of despair and a longing that's left unfulfilled, we've not read it well enough. So this morning I want to talk to you about the search for a meaningful life. We've identified the search here in these opening verses. Let me tell you a few things about the search that will help you understand what's going on in this very ancient book. Number one, it was an expert search. Solomon was no chump. Okay, this wasn't some just, entitled, rich, pseudo-smart guy trying to, sound like Confucius up in some ivory tower. The wisdom of Solomon is well known throughout world history. In the Bible, Solomon, the great king over Israel that we believe gave us this very book, he was known as the king that God gave more wisdom to than any other human being who had ever or who would ever live. So this is Solomon in all that great wisdom, at the height of the resources and power of the ancient Israelite kingdom, applying all of that wisdom and all those resources to this great question: how do I live a meaningful life? So here's what Ecclesiastes is. It's the world's greatest thinker devoting himself to the world's greatest question: how do I live a meaningful life? So it's an expert search. Notice also it's a very thorough search. A very thorough search. Notice in verse number 13 and 14, he talks about just how thorough it is. He says, I applied my mind, there in verse 13, to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done under heaven. Everything that happens here. He says it again in verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done here under the sun. Now, notice those words in verse 13, to examine and to explore. Two very intentionally chosen words. That word examine means to thoroughly and repeatedly investigate. So he didn't just sort of bounce his attention span off of this subject every here and there, but regularly, repeatedly, intentionally, systematically, he went about this question with everything that he had. That other word that's used in verse 13, the word explore, it's an entirely different word. It's not just a word meaning to thoroughly and repeatedly investigate, but this word means, hey, I'm going to go out there and try it on for myself. It's a word that can mean to go undercover and pretend even to be something that you're not. Here's Solomon's way of saying, as I go about this search, I'm going to be so systematic that I'm actually going to go and personally try out all the different ways that humanity seeks to find meaning in their life. And I'm going to see if I can find either the best one or the best combination of those ways of having a meaningful life. And I'll report back soon with the answers. It was a very thorough search. Now, what did he find? This expert, thorough searcher. Well, unfortunately, it wound up a very discouraging search. And you've already heard some of that as we read, but in verse 13, he refers to life as this miserable task. Now, some of you may have had a bad morning today, and that phrase may resonate with you. You may think, yeah, sometimes life is a pretty miserable task. He says in verse 14 that his search led him to conclude that everything was futile. He compares it to pursuing the wind. He even says in conclusion almost, what's crooked in life is something you're never going to be able to straighten out. It was a discouraging search because the more he learned, the harder he tried, the more difficult it became to accept the answer, until ultimately he's led to conclude in verse number 18, really the more I learned, the harder it was on me. Look at what verse 18 says. With much wisdom there is much sorrow. As knowledge increases, grief increases. Now, this is kind of a downer. Is that fair to say? I don't think you came to church today to be put down, so let me offer you just a little bit of a qualification here by saying finally about the search, it was a limited search. It was thorough, it was conducted by an expert, but it was limited in this way. Note now in verse 13, he says, I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that is done, and then he qualifies the scope of that search by saying, all that is done where? Under heaven, right here. He says it this way in verse 14, I've seen all the things that are done under the sun. That is temporary things, very time and space bound things. He's referring to the things of this life as we know it, just this life, without any thought of what might be happening in the next life or in the supernatural parts of our life. So he's applying all this wisdom to the here and now. And what he's ultimately going to conclude is, listen, if you put all the stock of your life into just the here and the now, at some point in your life, if not at the very end of your life, you're going to realize you wasted your life. Because everything here under the sun, right, apart from God and eternity and all of those factors, it all turns out to be futile. And that futility that he speaks of there, that vanity, that meaninglessness, it speaks of the fact that life is brief and that life is elusive. It's hard to grab. You can't just reach out and grab life and put it in a container and save it for a rainy day. You either got it or not. You're either living it in one moment or you're not. And also life's repetitive, right? You wake up and figure out what you got to do that day and put up with whatever nonsense you got to put up with and hopefully find some time for yourself and your family and then hopefully get a good night's sleep, because guess what? Boom! You got to wake up and do it again tomorrow for a lifetime. That's a little bit about the search. So this search for a meaningful life was a search that looked at everything done under the sun. Now we'll get to a point where we're going to talk about, hey, well, what happens over the sun? Right? We don't want to lose sight of that as we delve more deeply into the darkness that can be Ecclesiastes. But the results weren't good. This expert search turned up some really negative test results. So before we get too discouraged, let's consider what that means. What did Solomon look at that left him so in a state of despair? What were the different ways that he tried to live as he sought to discern how to live a meaningful life? And for that, consider this second category of thought this morning, the options. All right, what are the options in front of us? Because truth be known, sure, technology advances and times change, but the same options that Solomon had in front of him, hey, what can I do with my life to try to make it a meaningful life? They're really the same options that we have today. So let's look at the options, and as we look at them, remember, none of them in and of themselves are going to give us a meaningful life, but it is helpful to point out these four different options. There's four main ways that you can try and live a good life. I don't think they're necessarily exclusive one to the other, so it's not like you have to just pick one. In my experience, people will almost like a buffet, they will select some of this way and maybe some of this way, and in a different season of their life, they may try something else depending on what they're going through or how they're growing as a person. But in all of these different options, you're going to see the motivation's the same. We're trying to find happiness. We're trying to find meaning. We want to be able to lay our head down at night with little to no existential angst. We want to be able to sleep in peace, to think of the day that's just ending. You know, today was a pretty good day. I feel good about that. And I have hope also for tomorrow. If you can lay your head on your pillow at night and think that most nights, you know, you can live a pretty decent life. And in all these pursuits, the goal really is happiness. It reminds me of a well-known saying from many years ago. Back in the 1600s, Blaise Pascal was a French thinker, mathematician, philosopher. Dudes just seemed to be way smarter back then. Here's what he said. He said, all men seek happiness, and this is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend toward this same goal. It's the cause of some going to war and of others avoiding war. It's the same desire in both, just attended with different views. Everything a person does aims to accomplish this. It's the motive of every action of man, even of those who hang themselves. They're just trying to find peace and trying to find happiness. So what are the options? Let me lay out to you in 4 what I think are pretty easy to relate to phrases. Option number 1, to have a good time. We live to have a good time. Who doesn't want to have a good time? We all do. It's the reason we flip on the TV. It's the reason we scroll our social media feeds. It's the reason we take pictures of our children when they're doing things that are fun or exciting. We all want to have a good time. Life is hard, but if I can have fun, I don't have to think about how hard it is. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to have a good time. I think it's very inherent to what it means to be a human, created in the image of God, to want to have a good time with our lives. The problem is if we try to take that pursuit and turn it into more than what it was intended to be, right? Having a good time is great, but it's not ultimate. We can't get our meaning out of life simply from the pursuit of having a good time. Look at what Solomon says in chapter 2, verse number 1 to 3. He describes this way of life a little bit. He says, I said to myself, go ahead, I will test you with pleasure. Remember, he's out to search for the meaning of life. Here his first test is the test of pleasure or having a good time. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. And so I said about laughter. He's just talking about having fun, right? Being carefree. It's madness. And about pleasure, he says, well, what does this accomplish? And then in verse 3, he says, I even explored with my mind the pool of wine on my body. Talk about having a good time. Hey, let's get together with our friends, have a few drinks, forget our troubles. My mind, though, he said, was still guiding me with wisdom and how I could grasp folly until ultimately I wanted to see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. For the option of finding meaning in life through seeking to have a good time, we just seek to numb the pain, to look the other way. The idea is if I can have a good time today, then I don't have to worry about tomorrow. To these folks, the worst thing you can be is a buzzkill. Even today, many would much prefer to medicate their problems rather than to make the life changes necessary to deal with them more directly. There's so many vivid examples of this in the world of celebrity, where these celebrities have the means and the fame to really do whatever they want. And so they look for a good time. They cultivate an image of themselves as a person who's always having a good time. Now, I know this comes before so many of our eras, but Mickey Mantle was a baseball player that played back in the 50s and 60s. He was one of the most famous people in America while he played. He was voted to the All-Star team 20 different times. Mickey Mantle won the American League MVP 3 different years. In 1956, he won the Triple Crown, which is a batting title where you have the most RBIs, most home runs, and the highest batting average in the league. It's really, really incredible feat, very rare. There's so many accolades we could say about his life, and yet, good time Mickey had this to say near the end of his life. In 1994, a year before his death from alcohol-induced cirrhosis, hepatitis C, and inoperable liver cancer, Mickey Mantle gave this remorseful interview to Sports Illustrated. Now, I won't recount all the details in the interview, but he just described this horrible season in his life. And he waited right till the end, just in the last few months of his life, after really he had just wreaked such havoc on his body that his body had nothing left to give. He finally got sober and thought, I'm going to make something meaningful with my life. And in his last public appearance, he looked out at a room full of admiring fans with their children and grandchildren, and he said, if you want a role model, here's a role model. Don't be like me. Don't be like me. Now, Manuel is one of many sad but vivid illustrations about how people try to find meaning in their life by devoting themselves to a good time. Nothing wrong with a good time, but it's not ultimate. We cannot look to it to find our identity or our sense of purpose. A second way that people often try to find meaningful life is to be a successful person. That's different, although the ultimate pursuit is the same. You're trying to find meaning. You want to make your life count. You want to be proud of yourself and what you've done. This is the person who says, whether they use these words or not, their life's bent is, hey, yeah, life's hard, but I'm smart enough and I'm talented enough and I'm persistent enough. I can win at this game of life, even though it's really hard. To these folks, the worst thing you can be is a bum. There's nothing wrong with success. I think in a similar way to how God put it in our heart a desire to want to have fun, I think God also put in our heart a sense of healthy ambition, right? To have goals that mean things to us and to try to achieve those things. But what's wrong is when we use that to try and squeeze something out of life that those things were never intended to give us. It's like going to your favorite restaurant to pick up your prescription drugs. They don't serve those there. We can't go to these options looking for a good time, trying to be a successful person, and we can't find from those options a meaning in life that those options were never intended to give us. It reminds me of an interview I watched nearly 20 years ago. At the time I was a youth pastor, and I just remember hearing this interview thinking, oh man, that'll preach. I got to share this with my students. But it was the year of 2005. Tom Brady had just led the New England Patriots to win his third Super Bowl. I think he'd only been in the big leagues for 4 or 5 years. And so Tom Brady is sort of like on top of the world. He wasn't married at the time. He was considered like the world's most eligible bachelor. And there he is. There's this seasoned journalist from CBS's 60 Minutes. They sit down with Tom Brady right after he's just won his third Super Bowl ring. And he says to me, Tom, you've just won the Super Bowl again? You're the world's most eligible bachelor? What's next for Tom Brady? Brady answered very searchingly, and I'm quoting here. He said, I don't know. Why do I have 3 Super Bowl rings and still think there's something greater out there for me? There's got to be more than this. That's what he said. And I remember hearing that thinking, oh my gosh, is this guy going to become a Christian? I don't think he did, but there's still hope for Mr. Brady. Making success the measure of the meaning of your life is not going to turn out the way you think it is. Achieving your goals can be wonderful. It will never be ultimate. And so that way of life will ultimately prove meaningless. A third option before us that Solomon will describe is you can be the kind of person who just tries to do things the right way, right? Not the person who's trying to have a good time, not the person who's trying to be the most successful. Some people get a lot of pride out of saying, well, I did things the right way. And so in chapter 2, in verses 12 and following, Solomon will describe living by a certain code of wisdom. And he'll actually have a few positive things to say about that. In a nutshell, he says, hey, I'm going to be honest with you, living wisely is better than living foolishly. In general, it will go better for you to live a wise life than to live an irrational, foolish life that's just centered upon yourself. But still, even if you go through life trying to do everything the right way, one day, get ready for this, you're still going to die, just like the person who didn't do it the right way. And even if you're really successful, you're going to have to leave everything that you earned to someone else. And who knows what they're going to do with it. This too, Solomon will conclude, is futile. Now, there's a few things I want to say here, because I don't want to say living wisely is something we shouldn't pursue. I simply want to make the point, living wisely is not the ultimate pursuit of our life. It's a wonderful tool. It's something inside of us. We have a conscience. We have this sense of what's right and what's wrong. We should be a good person. But a few words of caution are in order. Living wisely is no guarantee of lasting happiness. Some people live wonderful lives and still find the rug pulled out from under them because of the brokenness of our world. What if you're really moral and also kind of miserable? That doesn't sound very fun. And I think there's a particular word of caution for us because, we're at church, so whether you like this characterization or not, we're sort of religious type of people. What if you are an uptight, goody two-shoes kind of person who gets their kicks out of convincing yourself you're better than other people? Now, first off, no one wants to be that. But if you make this your life's pursuit, I'm the person who does things the right way. If you're not careful, you'll wind up miserable, and you may not realize it, but you'll make the people around you miserable also. Some people, when it comes to living right or doing religion, they take themselves way too seriously. We should take the Lord seriously. We should take what He's called us to do seriously, but we should never take ourselves too seriously. So take caution here. One other option that Solomon speaks of here for how to pursue a meaningful life, and I describe it simply with the phrase, to be a hard worker. That's another way you can try to find meaning in your life. To do things the right way, to be a moral person, or here just to simply be a very hard worker. And he describes of himself there near the end of chapter 2, all of the work that he did over the course of his life to achieve the many wonderful things he achieved. And indeed, he was a very, very hard worker. And what does he conclude? Well, work is great, but it's not ultimate. We make lots of sacrifices for work, but we must remember we are more than what we do. And there are more important things in our life than the jobs that we go to each day or the status that we aspire to attain. In a nutshell, all these different options for finding meaning in your life have something in common. I don't mean to sound cynical, but this is just the way I read this passage here in Ecclesiastes 2. No matter the option we pursue or some combination there between, it seems all of them have this in common. It's just sort of like, if people would leave me alone and just let me pursue the things I want to pursue, then I would have the best life. So I've got all these great ideas, and people make it harder and harder to achieve that. And that's not a great mindset. It's not a great mindset at all. It puts us in the center of the picture. And I think that's a big part of the problem. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a novel that developed in the late 70s, early 80s, Douglas Adams writes about this supercomputer. It's a kind of a nerdy science fiction tale, but he writes about this powerful supercomputer named Deep Thought that's been given the task of determining, quote, the answer to life, the universe, and everything. The computer took an insanely long time to calculate its answer. It checked and it double-checked and triple-checked all the variables and computations. And then finally, again in this sort of over-the-top science fiction novel, after 7.5 million years of this giant computer doing one task, it spits out a simple, unambiguous answer and says to those who are nearby, the meaning of life is 42. 42? Someone yells at the computer. Is that all you've got to show for 7.5 million years of work? And the computer replies, I checked it very thoroughly, and that quite definitely is the answer. I think the problem, to be honest with you, is that you've actually never known what the real question is. And I think that's many of our problem as well when we go to look for the meaning of life. Similar to how the history of science needed a great Copernican revolution. wherein they discovered, the earth is not the center of the universe. It's actually the sun. And when they discovered that, it really just changed everything. In a very similar way, as we search for a meaningful life, we need to have a revolution that discovers we are not the center of the universe. God is the center of the universe. And here in Ecclesiastes, when Solomon gives us the answer to how to find meaning in our lives, that's right where he starts, by taking us out of the center and putting God right where he belongs, at the center of our lives. Let me tell you, friends, self-fulfillment is a myth. It is vanity. It is a chasing of the wind that you will never catch. When life is all about you, you will pretty much always be unhappy. And let me tell you, unhappiness, grumpy dispositions in general, that is not a fruit of the Spirit. Joy is a fruit of the Spirit. And so let me share with you in closing the answers that Solomon arrived at. Right, so we've looked at his search, we've looked at the various options he's tried, we've seen his despair at really every option is just a dead end search. So what are the answers? How do we live a meaningful life? And I think he tells us in the closing verses of chapter 2. Let me read them. Just a couple of verses there in chapter 2, verse 24 to 26. Here's what he says. After this elaborate search is conducted, every option is tried out personally. He says there in chapter 2, verse 24, there is nothing better for a person than to eat, drink, and enjoy his work. I have seen that even this is from God's hand. Because who can eat and who can enjoy a life apart from him? For to the person who is pleasing in his sight, he gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and accumulating in order to give to the one who is pleasing in God's sight. This too, he would conclude, is futile and a pursuit of the wind. I think there's three things that Solomon tells us here that are the answers to the search for a meaningful life. Number one, we need to live like God and be happy, for God is happy. Number two, we need to live with God and be humble, for no one stands in the presence of God filled with pride, only with awe and humility. And number three, we need to live for God, which is a life of holiness. And the problem is, most of our world today doesn't see the Christian faith as the center of happiness in the world. No one thinks to themselves, how can I be happy? Oh, I know. Christians are happy. I'll be one of them. And why do you think that is? I think it's because we too get wrapped up in the rat race that is pursuing all these other options, which put ourselves at the center rather than God at the center. We find our happiness in God, because God is happy. And that's the foundation of our life of joy. His mercy, His goodness. You want to know what's a meaningful life? Listen how simple this is. Solomon says, eat, drink, and enjoy your work. Be humble to know that God is in control, not you, and that's fine. He's really big, and we are really small. And that's just how it ought to be. If we can come to terms with that and accept it with contentment, that is how we find a meaningful life. Let me close with this. And I discovered not too long ago this notion of, it's a frame of mind that was developed out of the space exploration program in particular in the 1980s, when space shuttles were all the rage and people were going into space and coming back, and journalists started interviewing astronauts and things like that. They developed something known as the overview effect. It was the impression astronauts would have as soon as they came back to Earth the very first time they went to space. There was just this aura about them at having left planet Earth, and there above the earth, seeing the darkness and the vastness of space, and then looking back and seeing this tiny blue and green planet, and thinking, I'm just one tiny little person among the billions on that tiny little planet in this vast cosmos. And so many astronauts reported just this sensation of emotion and awe and smallness and humility. Many would even report getting emotional and feeling these just sort of religious, spiritual feelings. I'll tell you why. Because they realized who they were in the stark reality of the vastness of space. They were small. And that's okay. But see, we live in a time where the self is supposed to be this big thing. But God wants us to know He is the big thing. He is the big thing. You will find your meaning. You will find happiness in this life only in one way: by knowing Jesus Christ. God sent Him, His only Son, to this tiny little world to rescue people like you and me from the futility of life. You see, life wasn't supposed to be futile. Ecclesiastes was not a book that really was supposed to be written. But when sin entered the world was broken. And aside from God doing something just incredible to intervene, it would never be repaired. But Jesus came to fix this world, to give hope even in the midst of despair. If you're here this morning and you ever begin to experience some sort of existential crisis about why am I here? What do I exist for? What's the point in all this? Let me tell you what the point is. The point is for you to know God. He's big, and that's good. We are His creatures. He has made us. And the only way we work well and right and best is as small, humble worshipers of His. That's what He's called us to. I don't know if that idea seems radical to you, but let me tell you, it's thoroughly biblical. It's the message of God that we would worship Him in that way. Let me ask you, if you would, to bow with me.